Hello, welcome to Marine Science, Lesson 14. Now today we start our journey into the world of animals. There's going to be two lessons on animals. The first today is about vertebrates, and next week we'll be looking at invertebrates. So today animals with a backbone, and next time animals without a backbone. Now, following that, we'll do plants, of course. But today, the vertebrates can be broken down into four main families that we find, or classes to be more specific if we're going to use our taxonomies. Four different classes that we find most commonly in the ocean. There are others, vaguely. There are some amphibians that you will find in the ocean, but they're very, very rare. So in this course, we focus on the four main classes rather than anything more than that. This dolphin here is happy to say hello. It is a vertebrate because it has a backbone, That's how it goes. But of course, it's of the mammal family. It's not, it's not just any old vertebrate. It is a mammal. And the four classes that we're going to look at today are the mammals, like the dolphin, birds, they obviously have backbones, reptiles, which are a bit more rare than those other two in the ocean, but still, plenty of them, and of course fish. Fish are the big one. They are the creatures that we find most of, especially the vertebrates that we find most of in the ocean. So what is the difference between a mammal, a bird, a reptile, and a fish? Yeah, they all have a backbone, so they're all within that domain of being an animal and of being a vertebrate. But the four families are very different from each other. As we know, it would be hard to confuse a bird and a fish, right? You look at one and you instantly know, well, that's a bird or that's a fish. But we need to be a bit more specific in the differences. So there are three things that we're going to focus on here. The first is the skin covering. What are their outsides like? Do they have hair or scales or feathers? Basically. The reproductive methods. How do they reproduce, and how are the eggs fertilized, the females? That changes depending on whether you're a mammal, bird, reptile, or a fish. And then finally, the gas exchange. How do they breathe? What is it that helps them breathe? Most of these breathe in a very similar way, but the fish are a little bit different, as we'll see. So let us use some examples of creatures. These ones taken from your textbook. Hopefully you've seen these already. But here we've got just some examples of different mammals and birds to start with. So even though they are in the same class, mammals can differ hugely from each other, right? So we've got here an orca is our first. That's a cetacean. That's its kind of family of mammals that it lives in. We've got the pinnipeds, like a seal here, which looks a bit similar to a manatee, I'll give it that, but it's not identical, right? And then we've got the sirenians, like the manatee itself. So all of them mammals, but still definably different, yeah? But they all share the same characteristics of skin covering, of reproduction, and of the way that they breathe, yeah? Then we've got our two examples of birds here. First up, we've got the albatross. Now, the albatross is a kind of bird that will fly over the center. I say the center, maybe not the center of an ocean, but will fly over open ocean, over open water, and will dive down to catch fish in the ocean itself. Whereas our little oyster catcher here is out on the beach, and it doesn't go over the open ocean. It lives on the coast, digging little holes with its beak and pecking up delicious little morsels. They're both birds, and they both interact with the ocean, but in different ways, right? So, it again showing that not all mammals are the same, and not all the birds are the same either. We've then got our examples of reptiles, which look completely different from each other. Our first one here is a sea turtle, and the second one is a sea snake. I know which one of them I'd rather meet while swimming around, and it's not the sea snake, in case you were wondering. Now, our turtle here looks completely different from the snake, but they've got similarities, right? The way that they're covered in scales. The way that they breathe oxygen, neither of these are completely aquatic. They have to come up for oxygen. And they're both cold-blooded too, so they need to warm up to be able to get going, whereas mammals, for instance, have warm blood already. And then we've got the big category, the fish. And here we've got two different types of fishes, families of fish that we can see. The two major groups are the cartilaginous fish, so the ones with cartilage, that are made up of cartilage, and then we've got the ones that are bony, so they have more obvious bones made up of the kind of bones that we would experience in our own bodies, right? So examples of the cartilaginous fish are the sharks, and of a more bony fish we've got a big old tuna. And tuna are huge. This one's a big boy. I'm assuming it's a boy. I don't know. I can't gender tuna. What am I talking about? So, again, huge differences between a great big shark and a tiny sprat or something, but they're still fish. They're still in the class of fish. We're going to focus in on fish a lot more towards the end of this particular lesson. But for now, let's have a look at an overview of those different classes of vertebrates that we find in and around the ocean. So let me zoom in here a little bit and see if we can get this a bit closer. If you do need to see this closer, it is, again, I've stolen this one shamelessly from the textbook because, well, when they've made something that's useful, I'm quite happy to steal it. But we've got here our 5 columns, 4 rows, and each of these different rows shows a different type or a different class of vertebrate animal. We've got the mammals, we've got the birds, we've got the reptiles, and we've got the fish. And first of all, it shows the differences between skin covering. Each of the classes has a very different skin covering. Mammals, they have fur or hair, which is essentially a very similar thing, made from keratin, the same stuff that our hair is. We're mammals, of course we are, but we've got hair. Some of us more hair than others, some of us less hair than others, depending on where you look. But also, keratin is what our fingernails are made of, that kind of thing. So you might think, well, hang on, what about that dolphin that we saw up front? It didn't look very hairy or furry. But mammals like dolphins, whales, things like that, they've lost most of their hair. You don't see, hair all over their bodies. I quite like the idea of like a woolly dolphin. That'd be quite cool. That'd be a cool Ice Age animal, wouldn't it? But really, heavy fur or hair is not what you want in the ocean. It's going to create drag. It's going to get waterlogged and weigh you down. But they still do have hair. Dolphins, whales, they've got little eyelashes. Oh, little hairy eyelashes, which is kind of cute, I suppose. Now birds, of course, and this won't come as much of a surprise, birds don't have hair, they have feathers. Okay, these feathers are also made from keratin, so a very similar, building block there. But we know that feathers are different from hair, right? I used to own a turkey who had, beautiful plumage, beautiful feathers, and turkeys, they have little funny, like almost hairy beards. They're kind of weird, at least the males of the species do. But I don't know of any sort of marine birds. You wouldn't find a turkey in or around the ocean, that's for sure. They're far too gangly. But feathers is what we would expect from a bird. Feathers much lighter than hair, helping with flight and also more aerodynamically structured. We've then got our reptiles. They have scales, and their scales, again, are made from keratin. So in a way, mammals, birds, and reptiles, although their outer coverings are quite different, they're all keratin based. So there is some similarity there. The odd one out, and so often the odd one out, is the fish. The fish, they do have scales, but they're not made from keratin. I'm not entirely sure what the scales of a fish are made of, but yeah, not keratin, that's for sure. I mean, with cartilaginous fish, I believe their scales are made of cartilage. I'm not so sure about the bony fish. Now, I've got some examples of these creatures up here, which we'll zoom in on because we always like a cute animal, don't we? So we can see our hairy covering here on the manatee. If I zoom right in, you'll notice it's got little whiskers all over its face, and you can just about make out sort of the little hairs all over its body. It's not the hairiest of creatures, but you can see the hair there. Here we've got our albatross, a young albatross, with beautiful feathers, ranging from very, very pale coloured all the way to very, very dark. Pretty much all over its body except for its beak. Here we've got a sea snake, looking great with its scales. You can see the rippling scales on its body there. And then here we have a cartilaginous fish. I really can't say that word very well, can I? The hammerhead shark. Its scales, you can barely notice them, but its entire body is covered in them. But they're so sort of close together and overlapping that, that's what we get. We then talk about their reproductive methods. So how do they reproduce? This will tie back with the lesson we did on reproduction, of course. So our mammals, they have eggs or egg cells that are fertilized internally by the male introducing sperm into the female's body. Okay, so it's got to be done internally. The offspring develop inside the mother's body until they are born. So you can say, this mammal is pregnant. I mean, you can say that about all mammals. You've got a pregnant manatee. You've got a pregnant whale. You can't say you've got a pregnant bird. That makes no sense because birds, of course, they lay eggs, right? So the development of the offspring is done external to the body. But for all mammals, we're going to find the child of the species, I don't know if that's the correct word, the young of the species, are going to develop within inside the female. Cool. Exactly how humans work, right? We are a mammal, we fit in this class. It's the same for us. When it comes to birds, egg cells are fertilized internally by the male introducing sperm into the female's body. So in that sense, they're exactly the same as mammals. They have to have sexual intercourse to fertilize eggs. Cool. But then the big difference is that the fertilized eggs, which are hard-shelled, if you've ever picked up an egg, you'll realize the shell is pretty hard. I mean, I'm talking the obvious here, right? So they lay the eggs, and then offspring develop inside the eggs. They have to be kept warm, they have to be kept safe, and that's usually the female of the species' job, but certainly not always. Famously, male and female penguins will share the responsibility of keeping those eggs warm in the cold, cold Antarctic winter. But yeah, that's the big difference between mammals. You don't walk around and find, I don't know, a manatee nest and find it full of manatee eggs. That would be weird. So yeah, birds have eggs. Mammals, the young, grow up internally. We've then got our reptiles. So again, the egg cells are fertilized internally by the male introducing sperm into the female's body. So same as our birds and mammals. There's also a very big similarity with birds here. The fertilized eggs, which are semi-hard-shelled. That's the big difference. So instead of having a really hard, solid outer shell like a chicken egg would, our reptiles, they have kind of squidgy, I want to say. They're kind of squidgy. If you've ever seen turtle eggs or snake eggs, they got a little squidge to them. They make a good fidget toy. I mean, you wouldn't. That would be a terrible thing to do, but they feel like they would. So they're laid, and the offspring develop inside the eggs. So, just like with our birds. We then have our fish. So with fish, egg cells are released by females, and then they are fertilized in the water by sperm from the males. So suddenly we've gone from internal fertilization to external fertilization. You don't see, I don't know, again, manatees going around dropping loads of eggs or egg cells, not eggs, but that are then fertilized by a passing male. That's not how that works. Our mammals, birds, reptiles, they all have to have sexual intercourse in order to reproduce. Fish don't. The female drops the eggs, the male comes by, spreads the sperm cells, and bing bada boom, you've got yourself some fertilized eggs. Now, the larval fish hatch from free floating eggs and grow in the sea. So the eggs, kind of like with birds and reptiles, They are, of course, kept externally, which would make sense because they were fertilized in the first place externally. They have to be protected. They have to be looked after. They have to be kept at the correct climatic temperature, and then we get baby fish. Nice. Now, gas exchange is much simpler. When it comes to mammals, birds, and reptiles, they're all the same. They all breathe using their lungs. Take a deep breath. The air comes in, we filter through the oxygen and stuff. We breathe out carbon dioxide. Easy peasy. I mean, I say easy peasy, it's quite complex, but to humans, we get breathing, right? That's what we do. And birds and reptiles are just the same as us. But of course, another one of those odd ones out is the fish. The fish, because it lives within water, cannot breathe through lungs. All they would do is get their lungs filled with water and they die pretty quick. Which is what we would do if we tried taking a deep breath in the ocean. It's not something to encourage, that's for sure. But for fish, they don't do that because they use gills instead. Gills filter oxygen out of the water and keep them, breathing. Pretty neat, right? And then finally, we've got some examples here. The examples that we saw over the page. So whales and manatees and sea snakes and turtles and sharks and rays and tunas, all that kind of stuff. So there we go. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it's a really good idea to maybe create your own copy of this table, or one much like it. You might want to paraphrase or sort of do your own thing. But knowing those key differences between mammals, birds, reptiles and fish is going to be of key importance. So it's well worth, going over that, making your own version. You could do something maybe a bit funkier with different pictures and colours and stuff, but it's a good activity to do because it's going to get that stuck in your head. Okay. Now, we're going to look next at the odd ones out, the fish, right? We'll leave mammals, birds and reptiles to one side, but by far the most common, and probably, I'm guessing, the kind of creature here, or the kind of vertebrate animal here, that you're less familiar with might be the fish. You're used to mammals because we are mammals, and birds and reptiles, as we've seen, have many similarities to mammals, so it's not, they're not that crazy different. But fish, they feel like a whole different thing. They are, but they're still in that large domain of ourselves. So here we've got a nicely labelled fish here. It's got the nares, the operculum, the pelvic fin, the pectoral fin, the dorsal fin, the lateral line, the anal fin, and the caudal fin, all well pointed out here, if I can say that. Now, we need to know what each of those different things means. So we're going to start by looking at the operculum, the scales, the lateral line, and the nares, and then we'll go on to looking at each of those different types of fins and why they're important. Now, these are the characteristics that are common between the vast majority of fish. Now, there will always be, examples of fish that maybe don't have pectoral fins or whatever, but these characteristics are the huge majority of fish will have these different characteristics, and that's kind of what makes them fish, right? So let us start. See if I can get a little bit closer here because some of my definitions are quite small. There we go. That might be better. We'll start with the operculum. Now, the operculum is, as you can see here on the diagram, it's a bony cover over the gills. So you can often sort of make out the gills, but they've got a covering over them, so they're not like just holes in a fish. That would be a problem for, well, several reasons. What these bony covers do is they protect those very vulnerable gills, yeah? I mean, we don't have our lungs on the outside, do we? We don't walk around with just these lungs sort of pumping in and out because, anything that bumped into us or, if we fell over, we burst a lung. That would be terrible. So just like us, they keep those gills, I don't know, I'm tapping my neck, that's where my gills are. They keep their gills covered over with this operculum, which is going to keep them nice and safe and stop anything crazy going on. But there's more than that. They're also a valve that prevents water flowing backwards over the gills, because this would lead to drowning of the fish. You want water going in one way and coming out the other. You don't want it flowing the wrong way, because I imagine that would be like us sort of breathing in the wrong way. Is that a thing you can do? Sort of breathing badly? I don't know. So they're not just there to protect, they're also there to help the function of the gills, which is important. Now, if you're a cartilaginous fish, which I still cannot say, one day I'll learn to say it properly, they have little slits instead. So often if you look at a shark, say, you'll see the gills a little bit more clearly because they've kind of got slits down their necks, or down their bodies, I suppose. So they don't have that operculum covering over their gills. Their gills are still protected because those slits are usually very small, and they're sort of the hide, if you like, of a cartilaginous fish is much tougher. So they still keep that sort of safety level up, if you like. But you wouldn't you see them because they haven't got an operculum hiding them, basically. Next up, we got the scales. So scales protect the fish. Again, it's like our skin. Yeah, we've got skin to protect our internal organs. Fish have scales. Makes sense. But the way that the scales work, they're also perfectly suited to being a fish, as you would imagine. They reduce drag. So if they had, let's go back to our example of like a hairy fish, right? If you had a hairy or a woolly fish, they would be really slow in the water because, hair, it kind of acts as a drag. If you're trying to swim through the water, you want to be bald, right? Those when you see the swimmers in the Olympics, they put those rubber hats over their heads because their hair is just going to get in the way. It's just going to slow them down. But if you compact all that down and have a smooth surface, you're going to move faster through the water. And of course, fish just don't bother with the hair in the first place. They're covered in those smooth scales. It also, these scales, they prevent water loss from within the fish. We don't often think of the fish having water within them, but of course they do. And it stops that water from excreting out into the ocean. We've then got the lateral line, which is shown here on the diagram as a line that runs sort of pretty much entirely down the body of the fish. In many species, this won't be as noticeable as we see it here on the diagram, right? We don't always see the lateral line, although if you open up a fish, you can often see it quite clearly. This is actually a sensory line, so it's kind of like, I don't know, our sense of touch or smell or whatever. We have nose and mouth and things like that we can sense things with. The lateral line is for the fish to sense vibrations in the water, so it can feel what the water is doing around it through that lateral line. That's really useful. If it's a predator, a carnivorous fish, then it needs to know when there are little fish around it so that it can swoop in and eat them, right? But if it's a smaller fish, it needs to know when those bigger fish are around trying to eat it, so it needs to be able to sense what's going on around it, behind it, at some distance away, so that they can get away from those predatory fish as quickly as possible, or any other threat that may be in the ocean. So a pretty useful and clever little bit of kit, the lateral line. And then something which is maybe more familiar to us, but we've got the nares. Now, these are a bit like noses. They're not noses. I put that in inverted commas because it's not a nose in the way that a mammal would have a nose. But I call it a nose because, well, it's at the front of the face, and it's made up of two little holes, much like our nostrils, so you can see why there's a similarity there. It's also sort of smelling, sort of. It's detecting chemical scents, so it's picking up smells, but not like we do from the air. It's picking up smells or scents from the water, something that our noses cannot do. If you try sniffing in the water, you're just going to get a lot of water up your nose, and you're going to choke, right? Fish, they're not breathing in, but they're sort of sensing the water as they move through it. It's not, those nares, like our noses, are not connected to our lungs. When I smell, I'm bringing air into my lungs, and I'm smelling it on the way through. Whereas the nares, they're not doing that because they're not, as far as I'm aware, they're not connected to the gills. So they are taking the water and they're sort of sampling it, and they're picking up on those chemicals. And they can use that to find food. they might find a mate, so the male might sniff out females, the species. And the salmon, they're a migratory fish. They always famously go back to where they were born to spawn, so to give off their eggs. The way that they do that, the way that they realize, figure out where they're going back to, is they smell their way home using their nares. So a pretty, again, impressive bit of kit. If you thought fish were simple creatures, they're not at all. They're very complicated and very, very funky. Now, finally, today, we're going to have a look at what those fins do. So, different fins on a fish will do different things. And again, everything's very small today. Try and sort of get it in there so we can see as much as possible. All these diagrams are in the textbook. If you've got the textbook, you can see them there. But we need to know the different types of fin and how they help the fish out, because they're not all the same. Not all the fins face in the same direction. Not all the fins move in a similar way, and they're all there for distinct jobs. They're not just random fins that sort of, I don't know, propelling the fish along. They're all doing different things. So first up, we need to know that a fish can move in 4 distinct ways. We've got rolling, pitching, yawing, and thrusting. Thrust is the most straightforward, I suppose. It's just forward motion through the water. That's thrust. Rolling, though, is where we spin around a central axis. So if you imagine you've got the fish facing up like this, it spins around like that and ends up at the same place. I can't even do it with my hand because I don't have fins and I'm not a fish. Our pitch is where the fish moves up and down, led by its head. So that's important. It's not sort of laterally just going up and down in the water. It's its head that's leading it up and down. That's our pitch, the pitch of the fish. And then we've got the yaw. That's the sideways movement, so changing direction, moving from left to right, from left to right. And each of those requires different fins to make it happen. The same fins that are controlling the roll, the dorsal and the anal fins, are not the same fins that are making the up-down motion of the head happen, the pitch, right? So as we can see on the diagram, it's dorsal and anal fins that control the roll. Control the roll, nice rhyme. It is the up and down motion, the pitch, that is controlled by the pectoral and the pelvic fins. And you can see on our diagram here that the pectoral and the pelvic fins are sort of the ones that are closest to its head, so they're controlling the pitch. The dorsal and anal fins are, probably the more commonly noticed fins, perhaps, I don't know. Although some fish have very big pectoral fins, I guess. So, yeah. Now, the yaw is also controlled by the pectoral and pelvic fins, so that's the same. But, of course, they're, making it move in a different direction. So, the pelvic and the pectoral fins may move in different angles or at different strengths relative to each other in order to create a pitch or a yaw, or a combination of the two, of course. They can pitch and yaw at the same time. You can lift up and move to the left or whatever. And then finally, our thrust. This is produced by the caudal fin. So that's the fin at the bottom. That's the tail of the fish, right? But it's not just a tail. We don't say a fish's tail. We say it's got the caudal fins, the fins at the back. That's what's powering along through the water. But the pectoral fins, they come in handy again. Those big sort of central fins on the side, because they can be extended to slow that thrust down, to brake. So the fish is powering itself along with its tail fin, if you like, its caudal fin to give it its proper name, but it can open up its pectoral fins to slow that down if it needs to come to a sudden stop. So again, crazy technical, yeah? These aren't just, creatures that blob around in the water. That's quite a complex set of fins working in unison in order to do some pretty complex maneuvers. It make almost I'll say, it makes the 2 basic feathers of a bird look quite simple, right? For a bird to fly, it has 2 wings. And yes, I know it has tail feathers and stuff to help out as well. But the fish, it's got all that power coming out the caudal fin, and then all of those different directions in movement, both laterally and horizontally, and spin, are caused by our dorsal, anal, pectoral, pelvic fins all working together. Incredible. All right, so that's our vertebrates, our mammals, our birds, our reptiles, and our fish. Next week, we're going to look at the creatures without a backbone, the ones that we call invertebrates. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.